mercy upon you. Mr. Bates, Mr. Pike.
In the heart of Knoxville, Tennessee, there's a story that still haunts the community decades later. It's a story about adolescence, about choices, and about a night in January 1995 that would forever change multiple lives. This is the story of Christa Pike, who at just 18 years old would become the youngest woman sentenced to death in the United States since the reinstatement of capital punishment. But to understand what happened on that cold winter night, we need to go back further. We need to understand where Christa came from, the world she grew up in, and the path that led her to that moment. Christa Gale Pike was born on March 10, 1976, in West Virginia. From the very beginning, her life was marked by instability. Her childhood was turbulent, filled with the kind of experiences that no child should have to endure. Growing up, Christa moved frequently. Her family situation was complex and often chaotic. Those who knew her during these years describe a young girl who seemed to be searching for something, perhaps stability, perhaps love, perhaps simply a place where she belonged. By the time she reached her teenage years, Christa had already experienced more hardship than many people face in a lifetime. She struggled in school, not necessarily because she lacked intelligence, but because the foundation beneath her kept shifting. Friends came and went as her family relocated from place to place. Mental health professionals would later document a history of psychological challenges. Christa had been diagnosed with various conditions during her youth, and there were indications that she needed support and intervention that she simply wasn't receiving consistently. But here's what's important to understand. This isn't an excuse for what would come later. Rather, it's context. It's a piece of the puzzle that helps us understand how a teenage girl could find herself on such a dark path. By 1994, at 17 years old, Christa found herself enrolled at the Job Corps Center in Knoxville, Tennessee. The Job Corps program was designed to help young people from disadvantaged backgrounds gain education and vocational training. For many teenagers, it represented hope, a chance to break cycles and build better futures. For Christa, it seemed like it might be that fresh start she'd been searching for. The Knoxville Job Corps Center sat on a campus that housed young people from all walks of life. They came from different states, different backgrounds, all united by the hope of learning a trade and building a future. Christa arrived there carrying all her past with her. At the Job Corps, she would attend classes, learn skills, and live in dormitories with other young women working toward the same goals. It was here that she met Tadaril Ship. Tadaril was 17, the same age as Christa when they met. He was also enrolled in the Job Corps program, also searching for direction in his life. Their relationship developed quickly. Those who observed them noted that it seemed intense from the start. Christa became deeply attached to Tadaril, and that attachment would prove significant in the events that followed. In these group living situations, friendships form rapidly. Young people spend their days together in classes, their evenings in common areas, their nights in nearby dorms. Relationships, both positive and negative, can intensify in these close quarters. Christa also met Shadala Peterson during this time. Shadala was another student at the Job Corps, another young woman navigating the challenges of the program and trying to find her way forward. And then there was Colleen Slambrook. Colleen was 19 years old, just a year older than Christa. She too was a Job Corps student, working towards certification in a trade, hoping to build a stable life for herself. By all accounts, Colleen was well liked. She was friendly, got along with most people, and was focused on completing her program. She had family who cared about her, friends who enjoyed her company. But in the complex social dynamics of the Job Corps Center, tensions began to develop. The exact origins of the conflict between Christa and Colleen remained somewhat unclear. Different people who were there at the time offered different perspectives on how the animosity began. What we know is this: Christa became convinced that Colleen was interested in Tadoril. Whether this was based on reality or perception is difficult to determine decades later. What matters is that Christa believed it, and that belief took root in her mind. In the weeks leading up to January 1995, those around Christa noticed her fixation on this perceived rivalry. She spoke about Colleen frequently, always in negative terms. The situation seemed to consume her thoughts. This is a pattern we see sometimes in young people, particularly those who haven't developed healthy coping mechanisms. A perceived slight becomes magnified. A possible rival becomes an obsession. Rational thinking gives way to emotional reactivity. Friends and acquaintances would later recall that Christa talked about wanting to confront Colleen. Some remember her making statements about teaching Colleen a lesson or making sure she stayed away from Tadoril. These weren't just passing comments. They were repeated statements, growing darker in tone as the days passed. Tadoril, for his part, seemed to encourage these feelings rather than discourage them. Their relationship had taken on a troubling dynamic, where Christa's insecurities and anger were being reinforced rather than calmed. Shadala Peterson was also present for many of these conversations. She heard the escalating rhetoric, witnessed the growing obsession. January 12, 1995, was a Thursday. It was cold in Knoxville that night, with temperatures dropping as evening approached. This was the night when words would turn into actions, when talk would become reality. The plan, as it was later described, was to lure Colleen away from the Job Corps Center. Christa would approach her, perhaps offer friendship or suggest they clear the air about the tension between them. Colleen, perhaps hoping to resolve whatever conflict existed, agreed to go with them. She walked with Christa, Tadoril, and Shadala away from the safety of the campus and toward a more secluded area. They ended up in a wooded area near the Job Corps Center, a place known locally as an isolated spot where students sometimes went to be away from supervision. What happened next in those woods would last for over 30 minutes. During that time, Colleen would experience fear and suffering that's difficult for the mind to fully comprehend. The details that emerged during the investigation and trial painted a picture of an encounter that began with confrontation and escalated into something far worse. Christa, driven by jealousy and rage that had been building for weeks, directed what happened. Tadoril participated actively in what occurred. Shadala, while not physically involved to the same degree, was present and did not intervene or seek help for Colleen. At some point during this encounter, Christa took a piece of Colleen's skull bone as what she would later describe as a souvenir. This detail, perhaps more than any other, would haunt investigators and the public. It spoke to a level of detachment from the humanity of what was happening that seemed almost incomprehensible. When it was over, they left Colleen there in the woods and returned to the Job Corps Center. The next morning, Colleen was discovered. A student walking through the area found her body and immediately alerted authorities. The Knoxville Police Department responded to the scene. What they found shocked even experienced investigators. The brutality of what had occurred was immediately apparent. The medical examiner would later determine the cause and manner of what had happened, documenting the extensive nature of Colleen's injuries. She had been subjected to a prolonged ordeal. Meanwhile, back at the Job Corps Center, life was continuing as normal for most students, but not for everyone. Within hours of the discovery, witnesses began coming forward. Fellow students had heard Christa talking about her plans. Some had heard her discussing what happened afterward, even bragging about it. One particularly chilling detail that emerged: Christa had apparently shown the piece of skull bone to other students, treating it as a trophy. This behavior immediately drew the attention of investigators. Most people who commit such acts try to hide their involvement. They certainly don't display evidence. But Christa seemed to want people to know what she'd done. The police moved quickly. Within a day of discovering Colleen's body, they had identified their suspects. On January 13th, just one day after Colleen's death, Christa Pike, Tadaril Ship, and Shadala Peterson were taken into custody. The interrogations began immediately. All three were questioned separately about what had happened. Shadala Peterson was the first to provide detailed information about the night. She described how the plan had been formed, how Colleen had been lured to the woods, and what had transpired there. In exchange for her cooperation and testimony, Shadala would eventually receive a plea deal. Tadaril initially was less forthcoming, but eventually the evidence and witness statements made denial impossible. Christa's interrogation was particularly notable. Rather than showing remorse or attempting to minimize her involvement, she seemed almost proud of what had occurred. Investigators noted her demeanor. She appeared unconcerned about the consequences she was facing. She provided details about the events of that night, including information that only someone present could have known. She discussed her motivations, her feelings about Colleen, her relationship with Tadaril. The physical evidence supported what witnesses and the suspects themselves were describing. The piece of skull bone was recovered. Evidence from the scene was processed and analyzed. As the investigation progressed, a picture emerged of a crime that was both planned and personal. This wasn't a random act or a situation that had spiraled out of control in a moment. This was something Christa had thought about, discussed with others, and then carried out. The question that everyone kept asking was, why? Why would an 18-year-old girl do something so extreme over a perceived romantic rivalry? Mental health experts would later attempt to answer this question, examining Christa's psychological state, her background, her capacity for empathy and impulse control. But no complete answer would ever fully satisfy those seeking to understand. The legal proceedings moved forward through 1995 and into 1996. The prosecution team, led by the Knox County District Attorney's Office, prepared their case carefully. They had witness testimony from fellow Job Corps students. They had Shadala's cooperation and detailed account. They had physical evidence. They had Christa's own statements. The defense faced an enormous challenge. How do you defend someone accused of such an act? Someone who had seemingly admitted to their involvement and shown little remorse. The defense strategy focused on Christa's age, her difficult background, her mental health issues. They argued that she had been influenced by Tadaril, that she wasn't fully capable of understanding the magnitude of her actions, that her troubled upbringing had left her without the emotional and psychological tools to handle situations in healthy ways. The prosecution countered that regardless of her age or background, Christa had made choices. She had planned what happened. She had carried it out. And afterward she had shown not regret but pride. Tadaril Ship's trial proceeded separately. He too faced serious charges for his role in what had occurred. The evidence against him was substantial. He had been an active participant in the events of that night. Shadala Peterson, having accepted a plea agreement in exchange for her testimony, received a sentence of 6 years. She would provide crucial testimony at both Christa's and Tadaril's trials. When Christa's trial began in March 1996, the courtroom was packed. The case had drawn significant media attention, both locally and nationally. The age of those involved, the nature of the crime, the apparent lack of remorse, all of these elements made it a case that captured public attention. The trial lasted several weeks. Witnesses testified about what they had seen and heard. Experts discussed Christa's mental state and background. The prosecution laid out their timeline and evidence. The defense argued for understanding and mercy. The jury heard it all. They saw photographs from the scene. They heard testimony about Colleen's final hours. They learned about Christa's troubled past, and then they deliberated. When they returned, they had reached their verdict, guilty on all counts, but the trial wasn't over. In Tennessee, when someone is convicted of first-degree murder, there's a second phase where the jury must decide on sentencing. The prosecution argued for the death penalty. They pointed to the premeditated nature of the crime, the extended duration of Colleen's suffering, and Christa's behavior afterward as aggravating factors. The defense argued for life in prison instead. They emphasized Christa's youth. She had been just 18 when the crime occurred. They discussed her mental health struggles, her traumatic childhood, her underdeveloped brain as a teenager. They argued that executing someone so young would be unjust. The jury deliberated on the sentence, and when they returned, they had made their decision: death. On March 30th, 1996, Christa Gale Pike, at 19 years old, was formally sentenced to death. She became the youngest woman on death row in the United States at that time. Tadar Il-Ship was convicted separately and received a life sentence with the possibility of parole after serving 25 years. Christa was transferred to the Tennessee Prison for Women, where the state's death row for women is located. The facility, situated in Nashville, would become her home for the foreseeable future. Life on death row is unlike life in general population. The isolation is profound. The routine is rigid. Every day follows the same pattern, with limited human contact and even more limited freedom. For Christa, now in her early 20s, this meant that her young adulthood would unfold in a 6-by-9-foot cell. While other people her age were going to college, starting careers, falling in love, having experiences, she was counting down days in isolation. The appeals process began almost immediately. In death penalty cases, appeals are automatic and extensive. Every aspect of the trial is reviewed. New evidence can be presented. Legal arguments are refined and reconsidered. Christa's appellate attorneys raised numerous issues: questions about her mental competency at the time of the crime, concerns about whether her trial attorneys had provided adequate defense, arguments about her age and brain development, challenges to the jury instructions and the sentencing process. These appeals would wind through the court system for years, going from state courts to federal courts and back again. In 2001, an execution date was actually set for Christa. It would have made her the first woman executed in Tennessee in roughly 200 years, but the execution was stayed, postponed by court order as appeals continued. Life continued on death row. Christa aged from her 20s into her 30s, then into her 40s. The young woman who had committed the crime became a middle-aged woman who had spent more than half her life in prison. Over the years, Christa's case has raised profound questions about justice, punishment, and redemption. Should someone who commits a terrible crime at 18 be executed for it? At what point does someone's capacity for change matter in how we punish them? How do we balance justice for victims with mercy for young offenders? These aren't easy questions, and people of good faith disagree strongly about the answers. Some argue that the severity of what Christa did demands the ultimate punishment. Colleen Slambrook was 19 years old with her whole life ahead of her. She died afraid and suffering because of choices Christa made. Her family was robbed of their daughter, sister, friend. Justice, in this view, means carrying out the sentence that was legally imposed. Others argue that executing someone for crimes committed as a teenager is fundamentally unjust, regardless of what they did. They point to brain science showing that the teenage brain, particularly the parts responsible for impulse control and understanding consequences, isn't fully developed. They note that Christa had severe mental health issues and a traumatic background that affected her decision-making. They argue that life in prison without parole would serve justice while acknowledging the defendant's youth and capacity for change. Colleen's family has had to live with their loss for nearly 3 decades now. They've endured not just the grief of losing her, but also the painful process of trials and appeals, media attention, and the constant reliving of what happened every time there's a new development in the case. Their pain is real and enduring. Nothing that happens to Christa can bring Colleen back or undo what occurred in those woods in January 1995. As of 2025, Christa Pike remains on death row in Tennessee. She is now in her late 40s, having spent more than 30 years in prison. The appeals continue, though they've been exhausted at the state level and have moved through federal courts. Each legal challenge is carefully considered, reviewed, and ultimately decided upon. Tennessee has been carrying out executions in recent years after a period of reduced activity. The state uses lethal injection as its method of execution, though inmates can choose the electric chair under certain circumstances. If Christa's appeals are ultimately exhausted and an execution date is set and carried out, she would still be among the youngest women executed in modern American history. Women make up a very small percentage of death row inmates nationwide. Currently, only about 50 women are on death row across all states, compared to thousands of men. Executions of women are exceedingly rare in the United States. Since the reinstatement of the death penalty in 1976, only 17 women have been executed nationwide. This is out of more than 1,500 total executions in that time period. The rarity of executing women, combined with Christa's young age at the time of her crime, makes her case particularly notable from a legal and sociological perspective. Tadar Ship remains in prison serving his life sentence. He will be eligible for parole consideration after serving 25 years, though parole eligibility doesn't guarantee release. Shadala Peterson was released from prison in 2016 after serving her 6-year sentence. She has lived her life outside of prison for nearly a decade now, presumably trying to move forward from her role in the events of January 1995. When we look at this case from a distance of 3 decades, what can we learn from it? First, we see the devastating consequences of unchecked jealousy and rage. What began as adolescent romantic jealousy escalated into something horrific because it wasn't addressed, wasn't managed, wasn't diffused before it reached a breaking point. We see the importance of intervention in the lives of troubled young people. Christa's difficult childhood and mental health struggles were documented, were known. But effective, consistent intervention didn't happen. We can't know if different circumstances would have changed the outcome, but we can recognize that struggling young people need support before they reach crisis points. We see how group dynamics can amplify negative behaviors. Christa didn't act alone. Tadaril encouraged rather than discouraged her worst impulses. Shadala was present and didn't intervene. In a different social situation, with different influences, would the outcome have been different? We see the profound, lasting impact of such acts on families and communities. Colleen's family has carried this loss for 30 years. The Job Corps community was traumatized. The wider Knoxville community had to grapple with what happened. And we see the ongoing national debate about juvenile justice and the death penalty. While Christa was legally an adult at 18, our understanding of brain development and maturity has evolved significantly since 1996. The Supreme Court has issued several rulings limiting the use of the death penalty for crimes committed by juveniles under 18, recognizing their reduced culpability and greater capacity for change. Should those protections extend to 18 or 19-year-olds? That question remains unresolved in our legal system. In all the legal proceedings, all the debates about justice and punishment, all the media coverage and analysis, It's essential that we not lose sight of Colleen Slambrook. Colleen was a real person with hopes and dreams. She was working to better her life through the Job Corps program. She had family who loved her and friends who enjoyed her company. She was just 19 years old when her life was taken from her. She never got to finish her training program, never got to start the career she was working toward, never got to experience all the moments that should have been ahead of her. Her family has had to live with this loss every single day for 30 years. Birthdays that Colleen never got to celebrate, milestones she never reached. A future that was stolen from her and from them. In focusing on the legal aspects of this case, on Christa's background and mental state, on the debates about justice and punishment, we must remember that at the heart of this story is a young woman who died afraid and suffering. Colleen deserves to be remembered not just as a victim in a notorious case, but as a person, someone's daughter, someone's friend, someone with value and dignity and a life that mattered. The pain inflicted that night in January 1995 rippled outward far beyond those woods. It touched Colleen's family, her friends, the Job Corps community, and the wider society that had to grapple with what happened. The story of Christa Pike raises questions we still struggle to answer as a society. How do we balance justice and mercy? How do we punish terrible acts while acknowledging the youth and circumstances of those who commit them? At what point does someone's capacity for change matter in determining their punishment? How do we honor victims while still grappling with complex questions about the offenders? These questions don't have easy answers. People of good faith, all seeking justice, can disagree strongly about what the right outcome should be. What we can all agree on is that what happened in January 1995 was a tragedy, for Colleen Slambrook, whose life was taken, for her family, who have endured decades of grief, and in a different way, for the young people whose choices that night set them on paths they could never return from. Christa Pike remains on death row, now a middle-aged woman who has spent more than half her life in a 6-by-9-foot cell. Whether she will ultimately be executed or spend the rest of her natural life in prison remains to be determined by courts and potentially by clemency decisions. But whatever happens in the legal realm, nothing can undo what occurred. Nothing can bring Colleen back. Nothing can erase the pain inflicted or restore the years lost. All we can do is try to learn from this tragedy, about the importance of supporting troubled youth, about the dangers of unchecked rage and jealousy, about the profound and irreversible consequences of our choices. And we can remember Colleen Slambrook, whose life had value and meaning beyond being a victim in a notorious case. She deserved the future that was taken from her. This has been the story of Christa Pike, the youngest woman on death row, a story about choices and consequences, about justice and mercy, about a night that changed everything. Thank you for watching.